Sorry to interrupt, but we can't hear online.
Oh, sorry. Shall we go back again? Okay. So sorry for the missed audio. The outline of the talk is here. Say at the front end, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the changes that are occurring in the Canadian North. And then I want to spend the bulk of my time on this case study of the ecology of Baffin Island fjords. Said most of this information that I'll be presenting at the front end of the talk comes from the Arctic report card. This is a NOAA product, and you're welcome to have a look there. It's been published for the better part of 20 years. What we have on this first slide is a long-term record of global atmospheric surface temperatures. They stretch back to the beginning of the 20th century here. And what I do want you to follow is the trend in the blue line, which talks about the circumpolar north. I've put the brackets on for specific purposes. We know that environments are susceptible to change. These are often normal, everyday occurrences. The long-term trends are important here. You can see in the first half of the 20th century that the circumpolar world was undergoing a phase of warming. From the mid-40s over to the mid-70s, that changed, and we had a period of cooling in the environment in the circumpolar world. And beginning at about 74, 75, that changed to an accelerating warming trend. And that's the one that I want us to focus our attention on this afternoon. We want to look at the landscape response to those warming temperatures. Much of the area that I study on is underlain by some form of permafrost. If you're not familiar with the term, permafrost refers to a situation in the ground where ground temperatures remain below 0 degrees Celsius for 2 or more consecutive years. You can see on the left-hand side here, it's gone again. Okay, the image is back. So in terms of permafrost then, what we're looking at is basically ice in the ground. And if you have a look on the right-hand side image here, you'll see what is known as massive ground ice. And above that is a portion of the permafrost that thaws every summer. And it's referred to as the active layer of permafrost. And I want you to focus your attention on the active layer because it's the changes in the active layer that are initiating very significant landscape responses to global warming. In this slide on the left-hand side, you see areas in the Western Canadian Arctic where the government of Canada, as well as territorial and other governments, are monitoring the temperatures of permafrost in boreholes. And I'd ask you to pay attention particularly to the sites that are indicated in red and orange, where these ground temperatures are now at or just below 0 degrees Celsius. These are areas where the permafrost is thawing as we speak. You can see that reflected in the right-hand side diagram. These are historic records about the depth of the active layer. And you can see here over this course of several years that the active layer is getting progressively deeper. And that trend continues forward to the present day. What happens when we thaw permafrost? Things like this happen. As we saw the permafrost, those ice-bonded sediments lose their strength and they fail spectacularly. This is a form of landsliding that occurs increasingly frequently in the Western Arctic. Geomorphologists refer to these events as retrogressive thaw flows. Another change that's happening in the terrestrial environment is a phenomenon known as the greening of the tundra. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. We've been able to monitor this with satellites since 1982. The satellites are picking up energy that's being reflected off of the vegetation cover. And some of that energy is unique to a signature, a spectral signature that's associated with chlorophyll in plants. So we can track changes in plant biomass using the satellite imagery here. And if you look there on the last point on this slide, what we've seen over the period 1982 to 2022 is that there's more and more things growing in the tundra. And I want you to be very specific with what those things are. They are woody shrubs. The output of those satellites is shown here. And I'd ask you to pay attention to the areas that are shown in the sort of green hues. These are the areas where tundra greening is most pronounced. And I'll draw your attention to two places. The northern slope of Alaska, which appears in the upper left of these images, and the area of northeastern Russia, which occurs in the lower right of these images. And this is where tundra greening is most pronounced. Associated with this expansion of woody shrub cover, and this is what we're talking about, shrubs invading the tundra, is the introduction of both North American or Eurasian beavers. So it depends on which side of the ocean you're on, but the beavers are expanding their range. They're taking advantage of this new supply of food and they're moving out into tundra landscapes. And you can see the impacts. This is an example from the Seward Peninsula in Alaska of what beavers can do to transform landscapes. So that Arctic River shown on the left-hand side has been transformed into a series of ponds or lakes. Now, this is a really important transformation. Ponds and lakes have the capacity to store summer heat. Long days in the north in the summertime, in the absence of a snow or ice cover, means that we can store an immense amount of heat in these lakes. And that heat is conducted into the underlying permafrost. And it brings about the transformation of river basins into terrain that looks like this. This is a mess. There's no free flow of water through that landscape anymore. We've got ground subsidence occurring here. The terrain is referred to as thermokarst. You may or may not be able to see the human figure on the far left-hand side of this image, but you get the idea here that this land has subsided on the order of 2 meters plus in 2 years in direct response to the dam building and ponding of beaver activity. Now, that's a terrain disturbance that we're trying to deal with in a North American context. Where this is happening in the Russian Federation, it's having profound effects on the harvesting of indigenous peoples in northeastern Russia. People there depend heavily on the salmon runs in the rivers, and the beavers are moving into these salmon rivers and damming them, and that prevents the upstream migration of the salmon, and it's actually causing these people to lose a very valuable country food resource. And so they spend an enormous amount of time and energy over the last several years basically blowing up or deconstructing beaver dams. I did say I want to get you into the ocean, so let's start there. We want to talk a little bit about sea ice because it has an enormous role to play in marine ecosystems. It also has a role to play in global climate. We can talk about that at the end of the talk. The sea ice cover in the Arctic Ocean and its adjacent seas undergoes a large annual variation. It covers roughly 16 million square kilometers at its winter maximum. It covers roughly 8 million square kilometers at its summer minimum. Those aerial coverages have been changing profoundly. And there was a significant shift in sea ice cover that began roughly at the turn of this century. There's two sets of data here. Don't worry about the noise. The black line refers to the aerial coverage of the winter sea ice cover. And you can see that there's been a decline, but it's been fairly gradual. The red lines refer to the variations in the aerial coverage of summer sea ice cover, and it's undergone catastrophic changes. All right. We're losing the cover of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. Why is that important? As we lose the sea ice cover, it opens up the ocean to sunlight. And again, long summer days means that we can pour sunlight into the surface waters, and that energy is transformed into a change in sea surface temperatures. I'm going to ask you to look at the diagram briefly, but the diagram in the lower left-hand corner is the one that I really want you to focus on. And the areas that are shown in red are the things that I need you to focus on for the next couple of slides. So just north of Scandinavia there, the Barents Sea, in Hudson Bay, and if you're looking at the top of the figure there, figure B, the Beaufort Sea. So we've seen significant increases in sea surface temperatures in response to the loss of the sea ice cover in the Arctic Ocean basin. Why is that important? Well, sea ice is an important habitat for several things that we're interested in as biologists. It's the platform on which bears hunt. Polar bears derive much of their food supply by hunting seals on sea ice. It's where seal pups are born. It's one of the first things that mother bears try and get to when they're lactating and try and support their pair of cubs. So bears are dependent on ice. And we're losing that ice cover, especially in the areas where we've seen those rising sea surface temperatures. This diagram comes to us from an organization known as Polar Bears International. It's responsible for monitoring global polar bear populations in the circumpolar Arctic. And I draw your attention to the diagram, the polygons that are shown in red. So up at the top, the South Beaufort Sea, and on the left-hand side, Western Hudson Bay and Southern Hudson Bay. Those were areas that I highlighted as being areas where there's been progressive warming, progressive loss of sea ice, and loss of habitat for bears. Western science tells us that this loss of sea ice is contributing to a decrease in the physical condition of the bears, and this has now got concerns in terms of population dynamics. The ice isn't just important for the bears, however, it's also important for the bear's favorite food source. This is an image of a ringed seal. Ringed seal pups are born on sea ice. They're weaned there for a couple of weeks for the mothers before they go off and live independent lives. So in terms of habitat for seals, sea ice is a critical habitat. For the adults and the pups, however, sea ice is there for a different reason. Seals feed on Arctic cod. Arctic cod feed on amphipod crustaceans, and amphipod crustaceans feed on the sea ice algae, the algae that grows at the base of the sea ice cover. As we lose the sea ice, we lose the primary producers in that food chain, which has implications all the way up to seals. There's also another marine mammal that relies on sea ice, walruses. It's not a breeding place, it's a hauling out habitat. Walruses, as you may be aware, they feed on the seabed. They're primarily feeding on mollusks, and they need a place to haul out over shallow water in order to rest between dives. And we're losing that habitat for walrus, and they're spending more and more time on land at the beach, where they then become vulnerable to predators like polar bears. The sea ice that I want you to focus on is what geographers refer to as shore-fast or land-fast ice. And we have an example of this from Pangnertung Fjord in eastern Baffin Island. Not only is this a vital habitat for the animals I've just described, it's also a vital habitat for human populations. Indigenous people use this as a winter highway. It gives them access to fishing spots. It gives them access to places where they hunt seals. It gives them access to places where they hunt beluga and narwhal. It's a vitally important link to their acquisition of traditional food sources. And we're losing that habitat as we speak. So this is just to remind us then that essential traditional subsistence activities are directly related to the presence and persistence of land-fast or shore-fast ice. And there are consequences for human populations when that ice disappears. And here's an example from the Bering Sea. This is a small Inupiat community known as Shishmaref. Normally, this very soft and vulnerable coastline would have been protected from wave erosion by shore-fast ice that would persist through the summer, and it no longer does. And in fact, this community has actually gone underwater. It's been removed from the map, and the people have actually been dislocated to the mainland. So here we had a whaling and sealing tradition that has been there for several thousand years. And in the matter of a couple of decades, that entire community has been wiped from the map, and they're now trying to figure out what to do with themselves on mainland Alaska. A similar problem again along the Bering Sea coastline. When we lose that protective ice cover, this is something that is increasingly possible. Think about what I said earlier. We're losing the sea ice cover in the Arctic Ocean basin. That allows the sun to warm up the surface waters, and that energizes storms in the same way that the warming of the Gulf of Mexico energizes hurricanes. The warming of the Arctic Ocean basin is energizing Arctic cyclones. And those very powerful storms, especially in the fall, drive storm surges which inundate coastal communities, as shown here. Unless you think that this is a phenomenon that is unique to the Alaskan coastline, it's not. We have a community in the southern Beaufort Sea. It's known as Tuktoyaktuk. The community is shown here on the right. This community has undergone real problems with shoreline erosion. You can see the historic shifts in shorelines over this 50-year period here. The white arrow is showing you the direction of shoreline retreat. In portions of this coastline, the shoreline retreats 10 meters a year. The community is barely 2 meters above sea level. Portions of it have already been removed by storm surges or storm waves, such as the ones you see in the right-hand image. Efforts have been made to try and armor that coastline. You can see the rock rubble that's been there at the wave, at the coastline here. None of those erosion measures have lasted more than 3 or 5 years. And just as what happened at Shishmaref, people at Tuktoyaktuk are now planning to make moves elsewhere. We're going to displace them from the coastline. That could happen in this forthcoming decade. So there are real risks to the absence of sea ice. We're in the ocean, so let's stay there. I didn't want to leave without making some of these observations of the impact of environmental change on indigenous harvesters. Their knowledge of environment has been acquired over not just decades, but centuries and millennia. And increasingly what they're discovering is that their traditional knowledge no longer works for them because of the nature and rate of environmental change. Traditional knowledge is increasingly not serving these communities very well. There's a little narrative here. It's linked to a phenomenon that's known as the borealization of the North. As we warm up the Arctic, as we saw with tundra greenness, we're also seeing species moving northwards. So here's an indigenous harvester, Sakayasakanek, Pond Inlet is a community at northern Baffin Island. And you can see his discussion with Ed Struzik. You don't know who Ed Struzik is. He's a freelance author based out of Alberta. He's lots of awards for his work on the North. And they're talking about the narwhal hunt in Lancaster Sound. And you can see the old gentleman is saying that normally when we go out to the ice edge, we could capture 60 of these whales. But this year we only got 3. You'll note here, he talks about the sea ice. It was unsafe to travel on the sea ice. We couldn't stay and shoot the narwhal. Well, what I really want you to talk about or focus on is the presence and the increasing presence of orca. As the sea ice disappears, orcas are starting to appear on both our eastern and western Arctic seaboards. And you can see his expression of dismay here. We've been watching these pods of orcas come into our territories. They kill some of the narwhals and they scare the rest of them away. So this is an important local food resource. This is Lancaster Sound. This is just off the community of Pond Inlet. This is one of their preferred country foods. These are narwhals. And there's the new predator in their midst. Those are orcas amongst sea ice. Having got you into the ocean, I want to stay there now. And this will be the sort of the crux of the talk today. I want to talk to you about research I've been involved in for some time now that looks at the ecology of the fjords of eastern Baffin Island. We'll need to set you up. We'll give you a brief description of the physical environmental setting of these fjords. And then I want to describe to you very briefly then the composition of the marine invertebrate communities that inhabit these fjords. The work on these fjords began in 1982. It was a very large scientific endeavor over 3 years. It was coordinated by the Geological Survey of Canada. It was referred to as the Sedimentology of Arctic Fjords experiment. Now, while most of this was talking or focused on research on physical processes, the movement of water, the movement of sediments, the nature of the seabed itself, the biology was an afterthought. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you what little knowledge we have of the ecology of these 3 fjords. Just to let you know then that they're exceptionally large and they're very deep. And they're influenced by the presence of glaciers in their watersheds. And that's an important part of this discussion. The glaciers that are in the watersheds are a vital source of fresh water and sediment that is discharged into these fjords and that influences the ecology of these fjords, as I hope to show you through the remainder of this presentation. To give you an example of what these fjords look like, that's Ytterbilyung Fjord on eastern Baffin Island. To give you some idea of scale, from the sea ice that you see here to the peaks of the mountains is on the order of 1,200 to 1,500 meters, and there may be as much as 600 meters under the sea ice. So we're talking about 2,100 meters of vertical relief. So these are really impressive landscapes. A map of the watershed, in this case of Ytterbilyung Fjord. The areas that are shown in stippling represent the presence of glaciers in the watersheds. And as I noted earlier, these glaciers are important sources for fresh water and sediment inputs to the fjords. In this set of 3 fjords, however, much of the sediment that's being moved in these systems is actually trapped at the head of the fjords, the area shown in the red ellipse here, and doesn't move out into deeper water. There is very limited study of the biota here. I can say honestly that they had 4 physical scientists and somebody who had a vague idea of what invertebrates were amongst those 4 scientists. I had a chance to listen to 72 hours of tapes recorded in a submersible vehicle by these physical scientists making observations of the biology of the seabed. And it goes like, ooh, look at the pink thing. Ooh, look at the white thing. Ooh, look at the green thing. So to say that biology was not the focus of SAFE is a safe bet. But here's what we do know. There was very limited grab sampling sediments required from the seabed. And here are the variety of organisms that were found there. Small and faunal bivalves, a variety of Polychaetus annelids, a variety of echinoderms, and some unusual minor phyla, peanut worms or sipunculids. The grab sampling was supported or complemented by drop cameras that were lowered to the seabed to capture images of the seabed, and other sets of organisms were recorded in those images. We've got buckcyanid gastropods or whelks, you might know them as. We've got sea cucumbers here, sea anemones and soft corals, sea spiders. We've got starfish down there. When we put all of that data together, well, I'm rushing ahead of myself. Some historic images of the seabed of these fjords. On the left-hand side, a drop camera image. The tubes that you see on the seabed here are the houses for Newfoundland polychaetes. They're carnivorous polychaetes that feed at the surface here. On the right-hand side, a picture that was acquired by the submersible. The boulders that are present on the floor of these fjords provide ideal habitats for a very rich and diverse apifauna. And this is one of the very typical things that you see here. These are what are referred to as basket stars or feather stars, and in this case, the crinoid Heliometra glacialis. The data sets that were acquired were subjected to a cluster analysis, and what came out of the cluster analysis are these 5 defined communities: a bivalve community, and a phyroid anemone community, and a Newfoundland polychaete community, a meldanid polychaete community, and a holothurian community. And you can see that they're stratified by depth. You may or may not be familiar with any of these things, so I included some pictures. So amongst the bivalves then, in the upper right-hand corner is one that's ubiquitous. It's the bivalve Portlandia arctica. The fellow in the upper left is a Newfoundland polychaete in his tube. In the lower right-hand corner are what are known as brittle stars or ophiuroid echinoderms. And in the lower left is a sea anemone. Continuing on, the upper 2 images are sea cucumbers or holothurians. In the lower right-hand corner, a meldanid polychaete. In the lower left-hand corner, what is referred to as a ceryanthid anemone. Those 5 communities exhibit distinct patterns. I'll start off with the meldanid polychaetes. They tend to occur in the middle and outer fjords at great depths, and that's shown by the stippling in this image here. The elasopod of the holothurian community is a subset of that meldanid association, and it's unique to Cambridge Fjord in the top slide here. The Portlandia, the bivalves, are uniquely associated with fjord head deltas. These are really dynamic environments. Large inputs of fresh water, lowered salinities, an enormous rate of sedimentation, unstable seabeds, and these very tough bivalves are survivors in that very rigorous environment. My research builds from that. I've moved to the Cumberland Peninsula here, and the work is conducted near the community of Kikiktajawak on eastern Baffin Island. We're going to be looking at the biology of 2 fjords here that are just to the south and west of Kikiktajawak. The fjords are known as Mactac and Coronation. And just to give you a sense of what those fjords look like, this is an old historic aerial photograph. The remnants of the last great ice sheets, the Penny ice cap, is the remnant of the Laurentide ice sheets that once covered North America. It's one of 2 remnants. Mactac on the right, Coronation in the middle, and adjacent to that, North Pangnertung Fjord. Another look, but this time a satellite image of those fjords. And the thing that I want you to focus on here is the presence of active glacial ice in these fjords. Unlike the 3 previous fjords, which were only lightly glaciarized, glaciers occupy the entirety of the watersheds of these fjords. They're higher energy environments. We see much greater influxes of fresh water, considerably greater influxes of sediment into the fjord heads of these environments. And that's going to be reflected in the biological changes we see in these environments. Again, one more look here. The Tidewater Glacier in Coronation Fjord on the left. You can see the outlet glacier just peeking around the corner in the upper left in the trough that leads into Mactac, and a very significant fjord head delta. I hope the image allows you to understand there's a very significant plume of suspended sediment there, and that has implications for the biology beneath it. The last thing I'll point out to, this influx of water and sediment brings about profound changes in the seabed. I hope you can appreciate the vertical scale of the image on the right. These are channels that have been eroded into the seabed by processes known as turbidity currents. They relate to the influx of fresh water and sediment at the fjord head. And the vertical relief there is on the order of 3 to 5 meters. So very powerful currents. And you can imagine what that's like when you're trying to live there, and animals do. So we're going to show you who lives there. So we've got information from these 5 stations. The numbers increase seaward. So we're going to look at the biology of Coronation and Mactac Fjord. I made reference to the community of Kikik-Tanjuak, and it's just out of the field of view here. Once again, these are large, they're deep fjords. The bottom waters are cold. Temperatures are always below 0 degrees Celsius, just above the freezing point of seawater. Very high salinities. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that these waters are fully oxygenated. It makes it easy for animals to settle in into the bed here. And of course, we have these very fine-grained sediments. The same thing in Mactac. Again, these are deep fjords, bottom temperatures approaching the freezing point of salt water, very high salinities, but fully oxygenated waters, and once again, fine-grained bottom sediments. Who have we observed here then? Well, we're familiar with some of these characters now. We find the infaunal bivalves again. We find the cucumbers and the anuphid polychaetes. There's a variety of other polychaetes that we didn't see in the other fjords that are present here. We've got the brittle stars again, and we have the ceryanthid anemones. So a similar cast of characters, but in slightly different combinations. All of this information comes to us exclusively from drop camera images. We don't have any ground truth based on grab samples from these fjords. We combined the data sets from Cambridge, Macbeth, and Iturbulung with the Coronation and Mactac data set. And what we got out of this, and here's a cluster analysis that looks at species composition, is that the Coronation and Mactac fjords don't look like anything we saw in the previous 3 fjords. They're distinctly different systems, different ecologies at least, in terms of the combination of organisms that give rise to these communities. They're there in different combinations, and that's shown in this hierarchical cluster analysis. We discovered that the 3 most important variables that give rise to this community pattern are water depth, bottom water salinity, and this last parameter, which is known as suspended particulate matter, the input of sediment at the fjord head. And you can see these communities are stratified by depth. The anuphids and the ophiuroids occur at shallow water. The bivalves, the sea anemones, the sea cucumbers occur in deeper water. And you can see here that there are variations in the amount of suspended sediment moving across the ocean floor in association with each of those benthic communities. And that becomes an important part of the story I'm trying to tell here. So I'll ask you to pay attention to that. I'm aiming for 420. What we do see are very strong contrasts, first and foremost, in the fjord head species composition. Anuphid polychaetes dominated this environment in Cambridge Fjord, but the brittle stars are the dominant form in Macbeth, Iturbulung, and Coronation fjords. We see similar strong contrasts when we move out into deeper water. All right. The soft bottom communities in Cambridge, Macbeth, and Iturbulung were characterized by the presence of infaunal bivalves and sea anemones. Those communities were replaced by, sea cucumbers and ceryanthid anemones when we come into Mactac and Coronation fjords. We believe that this is in part driven by the influence of suspended sediments on the supply of organic matter to the benthos. The organic matter in these fjords is largely marine derived. Carbon-nitrogen ratios confirm that, but that very rich, lipid-rich organic material is being diluted by the presence of clastic sediments in the water column. So where we have high sedimentation rates, we dilute that food source and make it less and less available to the benthos. And that is the situation in Coronation and Mactac Fjord. In the other three fjords, we see lower sedimentation rates. That means that the sediments are accumulating a greater quantity of this really lipid-rich marine production, and that feeds the communities there in a different way than it does in Mactac and Coronation. So the dilution of this really vitally important lipid-rich marine organic matter by this flux of sediments, we think is one of the factors that is structuring the benthic communities in these fjords. And just to say that there are these down fjord trends where we get dilution at the fjord heads, we have low organic carbon contents in the sediments. And as we move seawards where clastic sedimentation decreases, we see a progressive enrichment of the bottom sediments in organic matter, which then becomes the food sources for the benthos. Last slide and we're done. As I said in my abstract then, Pan-Arctic inventories of benthic macrofauna diversity suggest that the waters adjacent to our Arctic archipelago are some of the most poorly studied marine habitats in the entire circumpolar north. We don't know what's going on in our backyard. And this is really important. I've talked to you a little bit about environmental change. It has profound effects in the marine ecosystem, and it really is important that we establish baselines, who's there and how many and with whom, if we're going to have a baseline upon which we can do future assessments of environmental change. I wanted to end here where my journey as an Arctic researcher started. This is the community of Pangnirtung. It's just south of the Arctic Circle in eastern Baffin Island. And this is where I did my master's thesis research on the tidal flats here. Koyanimik, thank you. Rapturous applause in the audience here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got time for questions. If anyone has any questions from the audience in person, I can give you the microphone, or online, you can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat as well. Any questions from the audience?
Who am I speaking to, please? Okay, Margaret. Yes, please.
So I guess my question would be, with all of those communities that are living there, like all the different diverse communities, would they be especially vulnerable to like water temperature change in the next couple of years as that ice melts?
So I'm glad you really asked that question. What I didn't have time, I prepped, but didn't have time to go through that set of slides. When I mentioned this phenomenon of borealization, one of the things that's happening at the seabed are the introduction of new predators that are coming up from the North Atlantic and North Pacific, especially things like king crabs and snow crabs. And these predators are, they love to munch on bivalves. They like to munch on brittle stars. Well, they like to munch on tubiculus polychaetes. And where they become established, especially in the Bering Sea and in the Barents Sea north of Norway, they've had profound effects on the species composition of the benthos, where they've become prolific. So yes, they are vulnerable to temperature changes. Those temperature changes are introducing new predators into our marine ecosystems, and those new predators are having profound effects on the composition of the fjord or the seabed benthos. Yes. Thanks for the question. That's good.
I'm just reading out a comment from the Zoom chat. So Andrew Hebda said an important sign of stability in bedrock habitats is the presence of lithophagous gastropods in Baffin Bay. The sampling regime would not have noted them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the greatest unknowns are the biota that are associated with hard rock habitats. They're hard to sample. For the longest time, we've relied on benthic trawls or grab sampling, which obviously preferably biases our thing towards soft sediments. The photo imagery that we're getting recently, and I've been part of that for the last decade, sheds some light on that, but we can't acquire the ground truth. So he's absolutely correct. The imagery that we get is focused on large macrofauna or megafauna, and it doesn't get down to those smaller organisms. They're often invisible to the camera's view. So you're right, there's an enormous part of that epifaunal community that we don't know anything about because we can't sample it adequately. He's absolutely right. Yeah, I'll ask you to hang on to that though. This is an interesting interaction. What we've been discovering, and I've spent now the better part of 15 years working on hard substrates. There are ecosystem builders, these reefs that are built out of coralline algae or sponges. We have enormous sponge reefs up in the Arctic. And these are again places that we don't sample probably because they're on rocks. And so there's a wealth of information still to come out of that, and we haven't discovered the right way to get at them yet. Okay, thank you. Okay.
So Kira Mudri asks, given the difficulty of research in the north and the limited number of researchers willing to do this work, what would you say is the priority for marine ecosystem research in the Canadian Arctic?
Good for you. I'm glad you asked. So the Canadian Arctic research community, especially the Canadian Arctic marine research community, is small. And it's focused at two ends of the spectrum. So we have a lot of intense activity that's focused on primary production in all of its forms and the primary consumer. So we've got lots of people who research algae, and we've got lots of people who look after their consumers. And at the other end, we have the marine mammals and the benthos. So I'm showing my hand to the audience here, and I'm going to show how many fingers are active benthic researchers in a Canadian Arctic content. 3 of us. Myself, Kathleen Conlon at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and Philippe Archambault at the University of Laval. Now, there's a new group of people who are coming up. If you're familiar with the Polar Research Station that's up in Cambridge Bay, there are all sorts of people doing exciting things with marine macroalgae right now. So we do have a group of new career scientists coming in. But in terms of benthic organisms, we are so small, and we just don't have the capacity of the Europeans and the Russians and the Americans at all. So it really, I mean, I can literally say there are 3 of us who publish in this area in a Canadian context. So it's a challenge. And it's hard to get there. It's hard to generate the money because it's not sexy. This is a science communication problem, right? We're worried about the marine mammals, and most of the marine mammals, not all of them, but most of them don't interact with the seabed. And if we're looking at indigenous communities, most indigenous communities, they're coastal, but they interact with marine mammals and fish and birds. There are very few places in the Arctic that I can think of where we actually spend time worrying about things on the seabed. So where we have large tides in the Eastern Arctic, in Ungava Bay, in Frobisher Bay, in Cumberland Sound, people know about clams because they use them as a country food. Blue mussels and soft-shelled clams and cockles are part of the diet. They're country food. But it's only where you can access them, and that's very few places. Eider ducks feed on the seabed. They prefer blue mussels. So we've got seabirds that are important, especially in the Belcher Islands. They actually make clothing out of eider duck hides. But again, it's a small regional economy here. So walrus, the communities of Resolute Bay and Igloolik, they're walrus hunters. You get 1,500 pounds of dressed meat off a walrus carcass, and you get 60 pounds of shucked clams out of a walrus stomach. So you get a double whammy when you harvest a walrus. But again, we really don't think about it. And when you look at Inuit traditional knowledge, the Nunavut government has sponsored something called the Nunavut Coastal Resource Inventory. And when you look at the knowledge of the seabed, it's a very different thing than their knowledge of marine mammals. they're aware of it because they're aware of everything. But when you look at the depth of knowledge relative to the things that are really important in their traditional economies, the seabed is not at the front and center of that. So it's really hard to recruit into benthic research. Hope that answered the question. Good.
I was curious if you see any, in addition to sort of these like large scale, long-term changes that cause effects, I was wondering if you see any changes to like phenology, like seasonal phenology, and if that affects benthic communities at all. I'm just curious because in the system I study, in addition to like overall melting of ice, there's also changes to the timing of ice thaw in some areas.
Yeah.
Like that affects ecology. I was just curious if you see anything like that on the benthic communities as well.
Really important for large herbivores. Lactating caribou, reindeer, for example, muskoxen, and so on. This mismatch. So we're losing our snow cover earlier and earlier by days and weeks. That changes the phenology of the plants, and the plants are up and running before the lactating females get there. And so it changes the quality of the food that they're using to support their calves and to support their overall body condition. So there is that problem in terms of phenology. Absolutely. Yeah, we're greening, and we're greening up quicker. Yeah, because of this loss of snow cover. And of course, that means more energy to the ground, and things get warmed up earlier and things get kickstarted earlier. And, you know, that sort of traditional migration pattern has to accommodate. So we've got these very rapid changes in the environment, and how rapidly can those animal populations adjust is a problem. I would argue, if I'm allowed to expand on that for a bit, I'm going to focus on herbivores again. One of the other things that we've been seeing in the last 20 plus years as a result of climate change is a shift from snow in winter to rain. So there's a phenomenon known as rain on snow events. These are periods of time in the winter where for several days we get a warmer atmosphere, and whatever precipitation comes from it is not snow, but it's rain. And when that rain is delivered to the pre-existing snow cover, it infiltrates and freezes and produces an ice crust. If I'm a muskoxen, if I'm a Peary caribou, if I'm a barren ground caribou, I have to paw through that snow to get to the lichens that are my primary food source, and I can't. And when that happens sometimes, several times in a single winter season, it's catastrophic. So I can think of two examples. In the northeastern Russia, a die-off of 81,000 reindeer in a single winter season. So the Komi people, for whom reindeer are the lifeblood of their culture, and in a single season, they lost 81,000 animals. Starvation, poor condition, frost, and so on. The same thing happened, tens of thousands of muskoxen on Banks Island in the Western Canadian Arctic, a very important, substantial food source for the Inuit of Saxe Harbor. And again, tens of thousands of animals dead in a single winter season. All the outcome of these changing climate conditions. So yeah, there's all sorts of, you know, ripples going through the ecosystem up there. Yeah. Great questions, guys. Thank you. We're good.
All right, thanks everyone. With that, I guess we will conclude this week's seminar. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next seminar speaker, who I believe is an online only seminar speaker as well. So,
excellent.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'll get out of here. There's lots of stuff there in the chat. I don't know whether you wanted to follow. Oh, she's got that. Okay. Yeah.